Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à cette session.
Good afternoon and welcome to this session which aims to bring planning back to life, to boost planning. I'm Jean-Marc Vittori, I'm an editorialist in the Echo's journal, and for me it doesn't start very well because planification is not a very easy word to pronounce, and it reminds me of two personal memories that I would like to conjure up. The first is a board game that we had when I was a teenager called Echo Planning. And once we played 3 or 4 rounds, we understood that when you landed on the square, you can invest 100,000 euros in public investment. You had to do it because that's how you won the game. It was indicative planification, in the French-style planification that had been around for 2 or 3 decades. The other memory is a lesson at the university a little bit later that I had with Marie Lavigne. Marie Lavigne is an economist who is one of the world specialists of centralized economies. And she told me a story that really hit home. It's when she went to see her friends in Moscow. It was at the time of the URSS. She used to take electric bulbs with her. And she took electric bulbs with her because the production of electrical bulbs was planned. And therefore, the factories had to produce a certain amount. And this amount was not the number of light bulbs, but the number of watts. Therefore, the factories manufactured 500-watt light bulbs, which for bedside lamps was not very pleasant. And so every time I came, they asked me to bring electric bulbs. And that was the imperative Soviet planning that didn't work very well. So why am I talking to you about these old stories today? Well, there are 2 reasons for this. First of all, that planification in China seems to have yielded very positive results, where Soviet planification seems to have been one of the reasons for the failure of the URSS project. And the second reason is that we realize that if we really seriously want to move ahead in the ecological transition, the market forces left to their own devices will not be enough, and therefore we need planification for it to succeed. And that's what we're going to be talking about. I will introduce the speakers as they speak, and I will start by giving the floor to Helen Ray, who is the representative of the Cercle des Économistes in this session. She's a professor at the London School of Economics, and she was also in the central bank, where she will become the chief economist, and therefore she will, have the duty of reserve that will prevent her from writing in my newspaper. Thank you very much, Jean-Marc. So I will begin by going back to 1946, which was just after the Second World War, and France had the economy that had totally dwindled, we remember. And at that point, John Monnet convinced General de Gaulle to create the Commissariat au Plan. And my neighbor inherited this. And this was a period where we had very few resources, very little capital. And we also used money from the Marshall Plan. And it was a very tricky political situation on the international level. But Jean Monnet succeeded in his challenge to put France back on its feet because he had a strategy. And I think that's very important with what we're talking about today. His strategy was based on the fact that he had a very clear mission, a priority, which was to rebuild France and Europe. And he had a method which was very fruitful, which was based on the fact of having priorities, but really well thought out priorities. And there had to be an order. Should we begin by having tractors, or should we begin with steel, or should we begin with coal? All of this, kind of is part of a whole puzzle. It's not something you can think of lightly. We needed economic analysis, and above all, he got people working together. When I say people, this means that there were company managers representing the private sector. There were the trade unionists. So he had very good relationships with the trade unions and workers, and he had good relations with experts also, not just economists. And economists and experts do know things in certain areas, so they can be useful. But also he had relationships with high civil servants who also knew how to get the machine going. So when we put all of these people around the table and we had a sort of a concept of a clear mission and a strategic pathway, which was not a heavy planification, but it was a planification that didn't suffocate the market, but rather was a question of coordination. And this led to quite a spectacular success. So if we think about the current situation, we have similar ingredients. We're in a situation where we have tremendous challenges: the climate, energy, defense with support for Ukraine. We have very complicated international relations. We have very limited resources. And so I think that it would be good to think about this experience, because if we think this Monnet method is quite the contrary of demagogy, of populism. It means having long-term horizons and try and coordinate everybody with goodwill. If we look at what's happening in the world, and the panel will go into the detail of what I'm saying. So one example of advanced planification, as Jean-Marc said, is China. China has 5-year plans, and we're at the 15th 5-year plan. And it's effective and yet not effective at once. It's effective because, as Jean-Marc said, China has made tremendous progress by alleviating poverty in the scientific field, and now they have a lot of patents and undisputable industrial success. And when we talk about electric cars and even robotics, China is right up there. And yet, why do I say that it's not effective? Well, to achieve this result, the industrial policy really poured a lot of resources into this, so many resources that to some extent it prevents the consumption in China, because everything is put into industry, and therefore there's surplus production that cannot be absorbed by the Chinese market, and therefore it's flooding into the European markets and into the States with the consequences that we're familiar with. But it's also a threat for international relations. It's a threat for the global order to some extent. And it translates an imbalance in the development model. So that's on the Chinese side. When we look at what's happening on the American side, it's quite different. This is more populist, and it's the opposite of Monnet's model, because we're looking at something where we get rid of all of the experts. We don't like universities, we don't like science, we get rid of the experts in the key positions, and there's a sort of a privatization of the state functions, strategic functions, with collusion between SpaceX, which is replacing the NASA, and companies that are developing artificial intelligence, such as Meta or OpenAI or Anthropic, which are really setting the development standards for this industrial revolution, which is led by AI. And so it's the privatization of state strategic functions. In Europe, very briefly, we have a few initiatives that with regard to the climate, the Green Deal, and we can see the trouble this is giving us. We're totally lacking coordination in defense and the help for Ukraine, even with regard to our position with regard to the United States and China. So, there is a lot of work that remains to be done. And I will conclude there by saying that it would be good to try and revive Monnet's spirit here and think about how we can go about things in order to have gentle Monnet planification that coordinates everybody and allows us to move ahead. Thank you, Helen. So now let's quickly go round the world with our different speakers. We're going to begin with Clément Beaune. You were a European Minister of Transports. You need to look far ahead, and for now you are a High Commissioner for Strategy and the Plan. And you're a long-term observer of the Plan Institute, and you're very active. What is different between the planification of the 40s, 50s, 60s that Helen talked about and today? And, what can we revive? Well, I think that we indeed can draw the lessons from 1946 and what came after. This year we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of the plan, French plan, so there have been ups and downs, but we've never dismantled this planification. So that says something about the need for this. And today I'm always a bit cautious about trends. We are talking about it a lot again, but we must see whether this can be transposed or not. We can't become what we did in 1946. We do not want to become the Chinese model either. I mean, we'll no doubt speak later about the States, which is no doubt a little bit complicated to understand at the moment. But there are some points that Helen described very well about planning in 46 that we can summarize. You know, basically the plan was three things plus one. They were priorities. So this strategic document, the plan, which was prepared for 1 year, there was a plan council, a commission, an entire process. It was a well thought out document where we ranked things according to the hierarchy, and we didn't do everything all at once. So maybe we've lost sight of that. We have a lot of planning documents today. It's a French paradox, no, that's a European paradox. We have far more models available than during the times of Monet, which allows us to have a lot of tools, not talking about AI, but just spreadsheets. For example, that would have been so much easier to make plans. When you look at the archives, all of the tables and charts were done by hand. Today, we have a lot more tools. We have sectoral strategies. I mean, often strategies that are in a silo. I haven't really counted things, but when you look at the number of plans that are announced by the local authorities or the state through the climate, to transport, to agriculture, culture, we no doubt have dozens of plans over a number of years or long-term plans, but we don't have many clear priorities. That's the first thing that we can draw inspiration from. Secondly, arbitration, and I would like to underline this. Arbitration means that you assume that there are some things that are more important than others, but you assume the advantages and the disadvantages of each thing. Even when you have transport projects, because I'm familiar with that field, and ecological projects, for example, railway lines or the Lyon-Turin line, for example, all of these projects cost money. They have impacts which are environmental also. So to have the capacity of arbitrating, and we do this despite the disadvantages, we assume them, we describe them, and I think this is very important, and this is part of the public discourse, and this is what allowed the plan. And the third ingredient is stability. The tremendous advantage of the French planification that we no doubt lost, even when you have a plan in the sector today, is that there are yo-yo effects, which mean that we can't always meet our objectives and our commitments. I've experienced this in transport investments, but it's no doubt true in investments within the fields of climate and health. So you have not only pluriannuality, but infra-annuality. So, if you want to change certain things every 3 months, where there's a small problem of efficiency and legibility. So we must establish priority, arbitration, stability, and Helen described this very well. The method, it was a long work of consultation and preparation with company managers, different political parties. I wouldn't want us to experience things as John Monnet did, because he did this in his dining room with a cigar and a glass of cognac and hidden away. And this would not be possible nor desirable today. And we must say that we're talking about indicative or gentle planning in the time of Monet or Etienne Pierre. And it was largely administered when we set objectives for coal, for electricity, for steel. They were the very large public players that executed the instructions of the government. And that's not what I'm dreaming of, but it went with it. The planning was far easier to do than today. So it's 3 ingredients plus the method. I think that we can come back to these today. So I would like us to have planos, as we said, or the big options, as the Portuguese say, that are voted in the Parliament on tomography, climate, water management, defence, and where we set objectives, we assume them publicly, and we stick to them. So as we listen to you, we have the impression that the challenge is above all and first and foremost political. So we will go a little bit further south with Mohamed El Ketani. You are Managing Director of Attijara Wafa Bank, which is the first bank of Morocco in Africa. And first of all, seen from Morocco, what is planning for you? Thank you, Jean-Marc. For Morocco, planning is part of the revival culture of the country. And if we look back only over the 25 past years, we have experienced two main phases. The first phase coincided with the change in reign when Mohammed VI came to the throne, and he came with a strategic vision to really get the country back into motion and to massively develop a global world-class infrastructures, because it was the only way to attract foreign direct investment. And this is why during the 21st years, from 2000 to 2020, Morocco went through radical change. It built the El Jabed port, which in just a decade became the first African port, the first Mediterranean port in the top World 15, and the sixth port in terms of operational efficiency. It multiplied by 5 the motorway network. It developed the high-speed railway track with a partnership, a Franco-Moroccan partnership, and it betted on the energy transition by developing renewable energies. So that today, Morocco has the first African wind power capacity and solar power, and the energy mix currently is 45% for renewables, and the development plan aims by 2035 to exceed 52% in terms of the energy mix. So that is the first phase, which also was one of industrial scaling up through the development of integrated industrial zones that allowed Morocco to develop automobile industry for the export market, which was very fruitful. We have the first capacity of automobile vehicle export throughout the world, with practically 1 million units per year, and the first aeronautical sector of aeronautical components in Africa, which is in Morocco. Not one single Boeing or Airbus plane is produced where there isn't at least one component which was made in Morocco. And currently we are going through a second phase, and the second phase is the initiation of a new development model that relies above all on human capital in order to transform our youth into talent, to ensure a rising level of economic development. And so we will also be using artificial intelligence for this. And this is thanks to collective work that mobilized the government, the parliament, the political policies, whatever their leanings, civil society, the youth. And it took us more than 1 year. And this established the main objectives and horizons for 2035. Well, thank you. We can see that there are certain of the ingredients that were in French planning of the 50s and 60s in France, and then other more elements that are more specific to Morocco. Youssouf Makoum, you're managing partner of Cranmore, which is a financial consultant specialized in infrastructure and energy transition. You are Turkish and British. You were trained in France, and now you work in the Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And the same question as for Mohammed. What does planning in the Emirates mean? Thank you very much. What do we observe in the Gulf? I don't think we can hear you very well. The Gulf is composed of number countries. The dominant country, Saudi Arabia, and several other countries that are very economically strong in the Emirates and Qatar that are becoming large-scale economies. The approach was quite different between the countries, but with some common characteristics that could be relevant, even though the public funding, health, and the type of governments are very different. I will begin with the example of Saudi Arabia, which was organized around a 2030 vision, as they called it, which was a systematic approach to use private capital for energy infrastructure and traditional infrastructure. So it was a very clear, centralized method with an autonomous agency, which ensured that, to begin with, the execution had to be fast, and there was a rigorous monitoring and very fast feedback of information to adjust things if necessary. There were some exceptions that didn't go very well, like MEM, which was... So there was a constant exception with regard to what I was saying, and this was managed by the National Centre for Privatization, and which is supported by PRF. We are familiar with the questions that we're looking at today. The Emirates are slightly different, but despite everything, with this systematic focus on bankability, so there is fast execution with private capital if possible, systematically, and with a method that attempts to preserve competition. So to a certain extent, everything is done through calls to tender, but parallel to this, we create national champions that can match the results of the call for tenders. So a plan, but that preserves market systems, and which, insofar as possible in certain countries, it relies also on, not, I wouldn't say a democratic pathway, but an inclusive pathway that is quite broad. So consensual with regard to the priorities to determine. So to some extent, the state is a partner of these strategic priorities with market methods and a systematic execution with feedback loop of the information. Thank you. So we see consultation here, which was important in French planning, but also an important role of private capital and speed of execution. So another model. If I can very briefly, private capitals, which are counter-cyclic insofar as possible, with financial buffers that exist to cope with external shocks. So in difficult periods, the government steps in with its sovereign funds to support the projects as a substitute to private capitals. But in a counter-cyclic model, yes, because there are financial reserves that the other countries don't necessarily have.
And now, let's go somewhere where you might imagine that economic planning doesn't exist. With Heidi, she is an American economist. She works for the Council of Foreign Relations, an American think tank focused on international relations. She worked for the Obama administration, and you have a very complete overview.
Does planification or planning mean anything in the US now?
So first, this works, correct? The speaker? Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm planning to bring the planification word back with me to the United States. We might be able to use it. But I do think, when we think about industrial policy and how the US is evolving, it is most readily in the geopolitical context of building resilience and making investments in the United States, particularly where we see national security, economic security, and technological security all converging right now, and where we find that there is a need for investment in our own domestic resilience that will create jobs that have been lost over the years to promote growth. There is a rising desire, and particularly with the Trump administration, we're seeing industrial policy take bigger risks and really push the edges of what we've seen in Trump 1, in the Biden administration, and over the past year. I think we've really seen a very bold, muscular approach to industrial policy. And when I mean bold and muscular approach, it means that the U.S. government is taking equity stakes in government, in private companies and in publicly listed companies. So we have multiple agencies. The Department of Commerce has taken most of the equity stakes in many companies that I would say right now we're tracking at the Council on Foreign Relations about $26+ billion that has been invested by the Department of Commerce, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and our Development Finance Corporation overseas in ways that we really haven't done before in the United States. Equity and quasi-equity. This is, for example, the 10% stake in Intel. These are the many companies in the quantum computing space where we've seen direct equity investments. In defense industrial base, we've seen an expansion of instruments, particularly in the critical minerals and rare earth element space and with magnet production. So there you have a whole host of economic tools that the U.S. has used over many, many years. But those have been price floors, they've been loans, grants, guarantees, tax incentives. What we're doing right now is something qualitatively different. So that is the first thing I would say. This is something where I think at the end of it we're going to end up with a sovereign wealth fund in the United States. And I think we're well on our way to getting there. But I would remind you that at the end of the Biden administration, they were also talking about a sovereign wealth fund and a need for some kind of a direct equity investment, in particular companies where the markets were not able to compete, where there was a national security interest, but markets were not going to get us there. So that is something that is more consistent. I don't think it was considered a plan or planning, but it certainly is the impetus for what Trump 1 did, what Biden did, and now what Trump 2 is doing. So there is continuity where it might not be so obvious.
Thank you. Donc, on voit encore une approche très, très différente.
One more thing. Just because Hélène raised at the beginning SpaceX and Anthropic and OpenAI, we're seeing something happening that's very different right now. In the context of taking equity stakes, there is a bipartisan conversation that is happening that you have the Trump administration looking to take equity stakes in the major frontier AI model companies. You also have Bernie Sanders and other Democrats saying that this is something that is so existential. AI is really all we talk about in the US right now. It is so dominant in terms of what we're thinking about for the future of our economy and the potential disruption to labor markets and to the whole of the creative economy. We look at this as these giant AI companies have really used the data that has been scraped from all of humanity. And so the concept behind the equity stake is, okay, so if we're all going to, if our future is going to lose, you're going to be losing jobs, then at least there's something that is called now universal basic capital. Used to be universal basic income, and now it's considered universal basic capital. It's something Silicon Valley's talking about. It's something that the Trump administration is talking about, and it's something that some Democrats are talking about as well.
Voilà, donc vous avez peut-être une vision un peu différente de la notion de planification et de politique.
So this is a different vision of the industrial policy in the United States. Laurence, you are the director of the European Climate Foundation. You've been working on questions connected to ecological and climate transition, and you've been working in the world of negotiating in '98 in Kyoto, and you were one of the architects of the Paris climate in 2015. So why do you think we need planning in a green and energy transition? What do we need to do at the European and international level? So first of all, we have carried out very important discussions for the Paris Agreement. I wanted long-term strategies and targets, which was unusual. Indeed, until then, we had wanted to regulate the greenhouse gases emission over short periods, maybe 5-year periods, 10 max. So I put forward this hypothesis. There were dinners and we were getting ready with various stakeholders, and I was faced with two very different reactions. There was one individual that was part of the Obama administration then that didn't want to add any complexity. And then there was the Chinese special envoy that agreed with me and I wanted to have a long-term strategy. And I wanted that because I wanted to manage trade. I wanted us to have choices, and I just didn't think we would succeed in our endeavor in the short term. We needed to manage our investment in the long term. We had to manage logistics as well as all restructuring measures we needed to be implemented. And it started to work out because many countries implemented long-term strategies, such as Nigeria. Nigeria has a long-term strategy for carbon neutrality. Although it produces oil, Nigeria wants to phase out oil and gas through a long-term strategy. And I'm telling you, because without any long-term strategy, we will not fight climate change. We are too slow. But we can't make it because we need to transform an economy that started developing in the 19th century. It was based on fossil fuels. So we need time. But secondly, we need to transform the whole of the economy. We can't focus on transport or any other sector. Finally, we need to modernize our norms and investments. And I do think that this is our main obstacle, especially for European economies. They lack a long-term investment capacity, while being obsessed by debt and budget balance. So we're faced with a major trade-off. We must change, but this trade-off prevents us from getting this transition done. Sometimes we feel that Europe isn't important for climate change, but if Europe is too slow, there will be an appalling effect on all other economies except for the US economy. But there would be a staggering impact. So if we do not have any long-term planning or strategy, whatever the word you use, then we will make other countries very vulnerable, other countries that will struggle to get out of oil and gas. And let's end up on the other side of the world with Mohammed. When we last saw each other 15 years ago, you told me there are 15 African countries I'm working with. So what can you tell us about economic planning in Africa? Laurence mentioned Nigeria. Do you have anything to tell us about Africa? First of all, Africa focuses on planning more than we think. Africa has a strategy, but under the pressure of the population, leaders have to adopt strategic development plans in the medium and the long term to improve economy and to create jobs for those hundreds of thousands of young people who will get to the job market. And I see it through the Department of Economic Studies, because before investing in an African country, we analyze national development plans. And one thing is for sure, African states have a national development plan in the medium and in the long term. Design is perfect and abides by international standards. The problem is speed of execution is mobilizing long-term funding and ensuring stability and continuity. This plan shouldn't go against electorate mandate, and that is the main challenge here. How can we ensure this plan are sustainable? We may have to adapt them, but we live in a very volatile world. And what about the impact on African states? So those are things we can adopt, but we must act in the long term. And I agree with you. If we want a vision and strategy, we need a long-term vision. There might be mistakes and accidents along the way, but we must have a long-term vision. There are challenges, as Clément said earlier. So we need a long-term strategy, and we need the political dimension.
Well, and didn't work. As you know China too, I would like to know what you think about it.
So I am in awe of what China's been able to do over the past several decades. I think the transformation of China has been far greater than anyone could ever have imagined, and that now they are leading in many technologies. They are leading in many of the great innovations. They are still suffering from some challenges to their real estate bubble, I think in terms of youth unemployment. One of the areas that I believe that the US and China can cooperate much more closely is that because we are both leading in artificial intelligence, we are both seeing the very first ramifications of the job losses that are coming down the pike. Because I think China is actually ahead in seeing their youth being unemployed, where you have physics graduates from the top universities driving Ubers and delivering coffee. And I'm saying that because my daughter was a student at Tsinghua, and she was, it was not so funny for her friends who were studying there. One-child policy. Their families had worked very hard for them to actually get places in universities, and they had no place to go. I'm seeing that now with youth in the United States not being able to get jobs. So I do think this is something that both China and the US are seeing probably before Europe, and it's something we need to work and focus on together.
Alors le temps tourne, j'aurais voulu qu'on parle des outils, mais...
Time is flying. I wanted to talk about tools, but we must mention the European dimension. Mr. Lorenzi launched this event and focused that there is this European will to move forward. So I'm turning towards Clément. You are in charge of the French planning body. How can we coordinate both the national and European level? And why is it important to act on the European level too? Yes, it is. We must invest together in specific sectors in order to develop AI and to enhance our defense autonomy. So we must make sure that our defense industry work together, not putting together 27 industrial sectors, but as many as possible. So AI is a tool as well as a compass towards good practices, because AI is about finding good practices and planning too. So we mentioned a Chinese model that produced technological and industrial results that are remarkable, because there's also a lot of stability. But if we turn to our common challenges, demographic, adapting to AI, IT power, enhancing safety, then we should turn to our European neighbors. And recently we focused on natality, on birth control. We analyzed the Nordic model and compare it with the Hungarian model that will give checks to family. But I do think that the Nordic model is more efficient with parental leave. So we worked on public policy and we turned towards our neighbors' examples. Secondly, as I said before, some European countries are enhancing their planning strategy. I thought the French-style model with a company with great options. That's for Portugal. Portugal was as a government is elected for 5 years. They will define the big priorities: immigration, family, infrastructure. Everything is being discussed in the parliament. And I do think we should take it as an inspiration. And then what is done at the European level? We are talking about technocracy and some major players, but there is much stability. The European budget is under negotiation. It is a financial framework for the next 7 years, so it is quite complex to implement it. There is Russia, there is Ukraine in the story, but it is more than a mere check to our farming. It is a guarantee for safety and security for 7 years. And European budgets have always been on several years. A few words about tools. We mentioned methods, priorities, and arbitration. And if you want to avoid high and lows, there is one fundamental reform that must be done. We must have multi-year budgets that some European countries already implemented, like Austria. But what if we cannot make any adjustment each year? We must have a stable budget so we can avoid any useless discussions in the parliament, and then citizens will have guarantees about their taxes. For example, the tax system will not change every year, let alone every 6 months. So we do not have a several-year budget, and that's why we're facing issues. So we need to set a budget for several years. And in 2011, there was a reform being adopted in Parliament for a framework laws. It is there, and I do think it is a good reform. It is there to be used. Laurence, your foundation is a European one. Clément describes the European machinery. So what do you think we can do at European level for planning? We need to review our mindset in the EU. The EU is based on strong laws about competition. It is more about regulation than investment. Nevertheless, and furthermore, the European budget is really limited compared to the challenges ahead. It is only one sector-based policy that is there at the European level. It is the agriculture reform, but the EU has always focused on competition, on opening the market. And again, today there is a response to the crisis of international relations with the US. And the solution put forward by the Europeans is free trade. I have nothing against that, but I find it really interesting, as Europe was deeply influenced by the British regulation doctrine with the third vote of Blair that had a huge influence on all politics. The UK left the EU, but their logics remained in it. So there were some changes with state aid. There was a debate on public procurement. There is a revolution to carry out. Meaning, without an industrial policy, there will be no investment, and we need to create demand. So we need the intervention of the state. So we'll go until the equity share with the renationalization efforts implemented in China. And with this huge trade-off, do we want to continue our energy transition? But then we cannot be 100% dependent on China. And that's a huge challenge today. And that's exactly what Heidi said about what was happening in the US. Yusuf, you live out of Europe, but you do see what's going on here. How can we ensure there is a European planning that is similar to the one you described? Please be brief, because I'd like to have enough time to take a question in the audience. Firstly, I do think that Europe did well. I apologize, my level of French isn't that good. For example, take climate change and energy transition. Europe is set a strong example. Obviously, there have been some failures, but energy transition performance is unprecedented in Europe. And they were successful. There were successes with investment in infrastructure. So European planning isn't ideal, but it isn't a total failure from my viewpoint. Now we must ensure competition continuity, so the state must not be the substitute for the market. The state must provide options and incentives. There must be information feedback and adjustment, because we live in a world without landmarks. So how will these new planning efforts will react to this very uncertain world? I do not think that multi-year planning will be enough. How will we manage that? And the other countries are set example, but they're not ideal. Middle East countries were open to change their direction, to turn towards AI and to strategic investment with the private sector. So we navigate without landmarks, but with a planning that can be a compass and that can help us change our direction. Is there any question? Please bring us a mic. Please introduce yourself and be brief. Good afternoon. I have a question for Clément. It is about doability. How can you do planning when you have several billion-euro debt? How can you do it since European growth doesn't exceed 1%, but that our public spending grows by 1 or 2% each year? So debt is coming back into the debate. Planning isn't necessarily spending with our limits. So you suggested we will have to make an effort of financial and budget consolidation, but there are political choices to make. So at which pace? I do think there would be a budget cut rather than tax rises. In any case, we have all the reasons to plan everything. Because imagine if there's a reduction of expenditure, especially social expenditures, then there would be a multi-year solutions and planning. And without doing any stigmatization, there are local expenses account for 20% of national expenses. So there's an effort to be made at the local level. Local authorities don't know what their budget will be in a few months, or let alone in 1 year. So if you want to control local spending, we must give local authorities guarantees, provide them with funding for the basics. So planning is really crucial when you have to go and plan, when you have to go and make some cuts. And I hope there will be changes. We may have a majority in Parliament in 2027, and if we do, then we'll have to be hard in that planning. There are various types of planning, and it is incredible. So thank you very much for bringing forward all these models. Thank you, everyone.